Okay, continuing from part 1, we were talking about the op quads or operation quads that wind up the Dramatica structural chart like a Rubik's Cube. And we said that there were flips and rotates like these, where every single quad, like this, could be flipped diagonally in either direction, or the items inside the quad could be rotated 90 degrees to the left or 90 degrees to the right, one space clockwise or one space counterclockwise. And this represented how our minds began to build justifications. In other words, that if we decide we don't like what's going on with our feelings and say, this just doesn't feel right, I don't like today, I don't like the way today's going, or tomorrow, or the next day after that, then we might say, because I'm so unhappy, I'll stop thinking about my feelings and instead look at it logically and say, let me instead realize that a week from now this project will be over, the book report will be done, I won't have to suffer with all this, and therefore I'm just going to put my feelings aside for a week, even though I hate the way this feels. I'm not going to think about it anymore and just look towards it being only 1 week and focus on the logic. When we do that, we are effectively flipping our logic into place to replace our feelings. So if our feelings were here, we flip our logic over and we put it there instead. And in so doing, we've now changed the nature of this quad, which has 4 items in it, so that logic is where feeling was and feeling is where logic was. Feelings are now hidden in the background and logic has taken the forefront. We can also, in terms of time, move things around. Normally they go 1, 2, 3, 4 in our mental processes consistently in a balanced and untroubled mind that is in perfect harmony. Then things would move consistently through every quad in this entire chart in that 1, 2, 3, 4 pattern that I just drew. But if we don't like the way things are starting out, we always have to start out with one thing and we have to get through it. It's like, why not have dessert first instead of dessert last in a meal? Okay, well, putting dessert last means you have to get through the things you don't like to get to it. But that may not be the way you want to go. Substituting what comes first, or substituting what comes second and then third, moving those things around allows you to change the item that begins the process and the item that ends it without changing the order of the sequence. So you're not really breaking causality. Instead, you're merely changing where you pick up the process. In stories, that's called point of attack. Where do you begin the story? You could begin telling it anywhere. Where you decide to begin it is sort of like rotating this quad one way or another, conceptually. When you have rotates, and you have flips, which can go in either direction, a flip this way or a flip that way, a rotate clockwise or a rotate counterclockwise, then the two of them act together to wind up this whole model here and make it very complex. And the last thing we talked about in part 1 was that sometimes when you flip two things, they carry all the children underneath, meaning all the underlying mental processes that normally are associated with feeling, say. When we move feeling into place of logic, then it carries all its subtext or all its underlying processes, or sometimes it just leaves them behind and uses the considerations of logic instead, and leaves behind these feeling sub-processes to be looked at logically. And this is the way we can look deeply into different aspects of ourselves, by moving things without carrying the children, as it were, when we flip and rotate our processes. Instead, we can look deeply inside and say, well, what were those processes we were using under our feelings, and see them from the standpoint of logic instead. It allows us a complete view of all aspects of ourselves. But the final thing that happens, which is what's interesting because it makes the operations quads also a quad. The first thing we have is the flips. The second thing we have is the rotates. The third thing we apply is whether or not it takes the children. And then finally, this down here determines which winds up first, which one is applied to which side the objective or subjective winds up. Now, the wind up that is subjective is around the main character, our sense of self. How do we see things? That's one wind up in this chart. It twists it up like a clock ties it all in together, gets the entire clockwork wound wheels within wheels, and then unwinds over the course of the story. If it just wound up in one place, it would be a simple linear unwinding, and there would be no surprise. But it also winds up in a second place. If it winds up in the main character here, it might wind up in the objective or overall story here, meaning that the main character is screwed up in one way, as it were. The environment is screwed up in another way. And the real question is, which one is doubly screwed up? Because they don't wind up together. One winds up first, and the other winds up on the already out-of-kilter model that has been wound up by the first one. It can be either objective winds up first, or main character winds up first. Whichever one goes first is the one that's harder to unwind, because it's the one that's been doubly wound. And if you wind it part way, you'll completely unwind the other one, and then the problem's over, because you now have motive force only in the one that was left, the first one to be wound up, because it still has its dramatic potential to force change. Alright, so that is the final part, which is the orientation of how these are applied. Now you'll notice in the Dramatica questions there are 4 dynamic questions pertaining to the main character. Whether the main character changes or remains steadfast, whether the main character would rather be a doer or a beer, whether the main character has a male or female mental sex, and so on. Similarly, there are 4 questions about the overall story. Does it end in success-failure? Does it end in a good or bad feeling? Is it an action or decision story? And so on. Those 4 represent those 4 aspects of the op quads. So that when we look at one of those questions for main character is going to represent whether it flips. Another question is going to, well, not whether it flips, but whether it flips to the left or the right. Which orientation? Is it going to flip this way diagonally, or is it going to flip that way diagonally? That will be determined by one of those questions in the main character questions that you find in the story engine. In fact, we call them the 12 essential questions, and the first 8 are dynamic, 4 for the main character, and 4 for the objective story, and then 4 more that say how all of those dynamics are aligned, where ground zero is, where the center point from which everything winds up, where it's applied to the model at rest that we looked at earlier. So, these are the 4 questions of the main character, one determining which orientation of flip will occur, one determines which direction the rotation will occur, one determines whether it's going to be children taken or not children, and then the last one determines the orientation of all of that, how it shifts the way these are applied based on the last of those questions. Same thing in the objective story. 4 questions. One of them determines the rotation of the flip, the direction of the rotates, whether or not the children are taken, and the orientation of the operations within each of those quads. Now, the final 4 questions are the one that ask you for the problem element. It asks you for the issue that's thematically at the center of the story. It asks you for the concern of the story, and at the top level it asks you for the class that is the main character's domain or the objective story domain. So where these things are going to be applied, those are the last 4 questions it asks. Where in this model? In other words, which of these is it going to be, and under that, which of these 4, and under that, which of these 4, and under that, which of these 4? Or this one, maybe it's under that one, and then this one over here, and that one down there. By determining those 4 last questions of dynamics, it's called the drill down, and it tells you exactly where the center line or axis of this wind-up takes place. So, simply to recap at this point, because this discussion of the op quads is not going to tell you which question determines flips or rotates, or how the quads are lined up. That's very complex. It's documented in the software. It's hidden away. and it is not anything that needs to be understood to get the concepts. This introduction to op quads is simply to talk about grab the concept. So, to that end, let me summarize what we've talked about so far. This represents a structure of our own minds, the structure of the story mind in Dramatica. It is not a bunch of words. Each word represents a process. Each word in each of these little holes, and there's 64 at the bottom of each tower, so there's 256 at the bottom, 64 total at the next level, 16 at the next level, and 4 at the top. All of those terms, each one represents a process of the mind seen as an object, treated as an object, as in object-oriented programming. When the mind is at rest, meaning the mind has no inequities, the mind has no difficulties within itself as it looks at itself, or in its environment as it looks at its environment. It sees no problems anywhere, everything's in balance, everybody's content, everybody's happy. Okay? That is the mind at rest, or the structure at rest. And these processes all relate in ways that are very symmetrical. The mind is now a balanced mind. But when something moves us out of balance, and we have to replace our logic with our feelings, or replace induction with deduction, or replace hoping with dreaming, because we no longer have a valid hope, so we have to start dreaming for it instead because there's no real hope it'll ever happen. Those kinds of changes begin to wind up dramatic potential within our stories or within ourselves, and it makes us have justifications. It hides away the original issue by flipping it out of place or changing the sequence in which things occur, keeping the same order, but moving the starting point so that we no longer look at things through the same initial filter that we did before, and we only get to that later after we've already made other considerations when we rotate. Sometimes these things move just a single level out of the way and change its orientation because that's exactly where the problem is hitting, and we know it's only in that narrow band. Other times, the problem hits a whole area head-on, kind of like a cluster bomb attack on our minds or on our story minds and stories. And when this happens, then we move everything out of the way and carry all the children beneath when we flip or rotate. Other times, it's just targeted, and we only move one little thing out of the way and leave the children underneath, which also has the added advantage of allowing the new concept we flipped in, like logic moving to where feeling was, to be able to then look logically at the sub-processes of our feelings and understand them better. So this complex model of flips and rotates, as we often say, like a Rubik's Cube in a 3D chess set combined with a periodic table of story elements, when it all flips and rotates, those flips and rotates and whether they carry the children or not describes these processes. But it's different for men and women. It's different for spatial situations and temporal situations. And so we also have one final operation in our quad of operations, which were represented over here. If I can find those again, or not. We have the flips, the rotates, whether or not it takes the children, and then reorienting all of these, how they work. That is the job of the final corner of the op quad. Flips and rotates fall here in an op quad because that's the most K-based or mass-based. Rotate is the most process or thought or energy-based. Flips and rotates, whether or not it carries the children, is the most spatially based because it's talking about the spatial layout, not just the element itself flipping or rotating, but the entire area, which also deals with our ability. And clearly, if we're taking the children or not, changing the processes at the sub-level, it'll alter our ability. And then finally over here, because we spiral up to the next level of operations, we orient. It's the one, the odd man out, always in the lower left-hand corner because it's completed the circle, but it's really at a higher level, so it's not quite the same as the other three. And that's why that final orientation here falls there in the D quad, or the time quad, of the layout of the functions. That's basically, in a nutshell, the major concepts of how Dramatica's op quads or operation quads work to wind up the dramatic tension of a story, and how it represents how we deal with justifying things and trying to hide problems from ourselves and get to a central point of calm in our own minds.